As our panelists get seated for the day, I'd like to go ahead and actually welcome everybody back from the break. Today I would like to actually, before we get started with our panel, introduce Wendy Shanahan-Richards, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Aetna. They're serving as also a gold sponsor, and we're greatly appreciative of their support. So Wendy, come up for a few minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm a little vertically challenged, as you can see, so I'm just going to move this a little closer to me. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Devin, for just giving me a few minutes to speak. I just wanted to say that on behalf of my colleagues at Aetna Student Health and our president, Jeanne, we are just thrilled to be here and participating in the second Leadership Summit, sponsored by ACHA. We've been in the business of student health for over 30 years, partnering with schools and students and learning a lot about their healthcare needs and the challenges they face. But even prior to coming to this conference, but it's been certainly reinforced, we know that you all, with all the work you do on your campuses, whether it be in your healthcare centers, in your classrooms, in the counseling centers, on campus, really understand and have a full insight into the needs and challenges and successes of your students. And so we are learning a lot. I've been in the other room for the morning session, and it's just been, some really fantastic sharing of information and learning. So we thank you for that. I did want to just remind you that we are hosting a reception today between 4 and 6. If you're able to join us, we would love that. And it's going to be at the W Hotel here in DC at 515 15th Street at the Altitude Rooftop. And it's going to be a nice gathering. There'll be some great appetizers and hopefully a little networking and some good conversation. So we just wanted to, again, re-extend that invite to everyone. If you have any questions, there's several of us kind of milling about from Aetna Student Health, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. But with that, I will turn it, I guess, back over to Devin. So thank you again.
Oh yeah, our next session is Addressing Student Homelessness. I'd like to introduce Susan Hochman, who's our Assistant Director of University Health Services, University of Texas at Austin, and also Vice President of American College Health Association. So welcome, Susan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. All right, welcome. Your panel is titled Addressing Student Homelessness, and as Devin said, my name is Susan Hochman. I'm an Associate Director for the Counseling Mental Health Center and University Health Services at the University of Texas at Austin. This afternoon, I'll be moderating this discussion, and joining me today is Barbara Duffield, the Executive Director of SchoolHouse Connections, and Dr. Mayde Henson, who is the CEO of Covenant House, Washington. We may have a third panelist joining us shortly, and that is Dr. Jeanne Harris-Caldwell, Director of Student Health Services at Saddleback College. So thank you all for joining us today. Housing gaps for students is an issue, and the issues of homelessness on campuses are not new, but they are increasingly becoming in the public light. So combined with policy concerns and housing issues for young people at the K through 12 level, higher education, and later in life, this is a serious issue, and it will require serious discussion and innovative solutions to combat. The goal of this discussion is to understand the scope and implications of the housing gaps and homelessness among the national student body, what factors contribute to homelessness, and which students and institutions are particularly vulnerable to these issues. The goal of this panel is to have the most robust conversation and discussion about this topic as possible, so please do not feel beholden to the questions or limited to the question and answer format. Before we begin, I'd like to ask that our panelists give a little bit of introduction about themselves so we can get some context and understand their backgrounds and their work in this area. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Good afternoon. As she said, I'm Dr. Mayde Henson, and I'm currently the CEO of Covenant House Greater Washington, and have been in that role for 5 years. For most of you, I know many of you know Covenant House. It is the largest nonprofit nationally and internationally that supports young people who are experiencing homelessness, disconnection, and exploitation. Here in Greater Washington, we are also the region's largest nonprofit in that process. I give residency actually to over 150 young people and their children every night in one of my 7 housing communities here, and we support over 1,000 young people every year through our supportive and wraparound services, which are a component of this. But nationally, since I know that you're coming from across the country, and this is focusing on homelessness and housing and how it interacts with the university system. Covenant House internationally gives residency every night to over 2,000 young people at one of their locations or another. And as I said, I do partner with many of the universities here in this area to help with their emergency housing needs. And I have 31 young people that are in colleges and universities across the country from here.
And I am with SchoolHouse Connection. We are a relatively new organization, but I am not new to the issue of homelessness. SchoolHouse Connection is a national organization working to overcome homelessness through education. Our work is birth through post-secondary. So we have a focus on early childhood, K-12, and higher education. I worked for a long time for the National Coalition for the Homeless and then for the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth. And now at SchoolHouse Connection, where we are working both with education as our focus, but also those community partnerships that are so critical to making sure that children, youth, and young people have the support they need to succeed and see education as really the lasting path out of homelessness. So we do a lot of policy advocacy at the federal level and at the state level. We also do a lot of practical assistance, technical assistance in partnership with communities. Tomorrow you'll hear from Jillian Sitar, who's our higher education program manager, who will talk about some of the best practices across the country for supporting youth and young adults who are experiencing homelessness but trying to get through higher education. And I'm here today to give sort of a broader overview.
Thank you both. All right, so let's get started with our first question. In terms of higher education, what is the definition of homelessness?
You want to start?
Sure. There's a legal definition of homelessness. It's actually the same definition of homelessness for early childhood, K-12, and in the Higher Education Act. And that legal definition of homelessness is broader than what many people think of when they hear the word homeless. They think of somebody on the streets or in shelter. But the education definition, legally speaking, is lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And then within that, it also includes staying with others temporarily due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Sometimes that's called couch surfing or doubled up. It also includes staying in motels if you lack adequate alternative accommodations, and then also shelters and cars and places that are more traditionally thought as homeless. So it's a broader definition than I think what a lot of people think of when they hear the word homeless, but it's the reality because we don't have enough shelters for every young person who needs it. We don't have housing for every person who needs it. So the reality is, particularly for youth and young adults, they're trying to stay safe, they're trying to stay out of sight, they're less likely to be in a visible place, and they're more likely to be going from place to place to place. So that's the reality. It also makes it very challenging to identify them because it's a very invisible population of young people. And sometimes doing things like trading sex for a place to stay or other things that compromise their health and well-being. So I will say, lastly, on the definition, that sometimes that legal definition of homelessness doesn't match the studies. So you'll see studies coming out from Hope Lab and other places, and they use a definition of housing insecurity or homelessness. So sometimes it's not a neat match.
I think just to add to that, and sometimes the confusion comes because there's a different definition from the Department of Education than HUD. And so what you were just speaking around which is the more broader definition the Department of Education supports. The HUD definition is much more narrow than that, which also oftentimes causes a lot of conflict. So couch surfing does not count as homeless under the HUD definition. You have to be chronically homeless without on the street, and actually typically you have to be looked at out there for more than a year. So when they talk about studies and the looks and the differences, that's sometimes the difference. We'd like to embrace more the Department of Ed study because it actually does really reflect more about the realities of young people. And it also embedded underneath that is when you're in the K-12 scenario is the McKinney-Vento legislation which is why you don't see the instability as much there, because it addresses the fact of saying that young people can reside anywhere and that school system has to get them to school. Once they leave that environment, those protections are no longer there. So at the college and university level, you start to see those that were in fact protected under McKinney-Vento and have been unstable for many years and have been couch surfing and living with relatives, but been able to maintain a steady space for education. That no longer applies.
Thank you. So I'd like to get an idea, and I think most of our participants as well, as to the scope of this issue. So what is it that we're really looking at? How big is this, and is it something that's increasing?
So I think my lens is going to come from a very practical lens because I live with it every day. I will say that clearly it is a very real issue, but it is oftentimes invisible for those that are not in the work. As you were saying, they're not the persons that you see standing on the corner. Young people who basically are experiencing homelessness are those that are finding resourcefully a friend or someone that they can connect with. So in that process, is it growing? The answer from our perspective, and I can speak from a Covenant House perspective, it has grown phenomenally. So as we look at over the years, and I've been in that role for 5 years, I can honestly say there has never been one day that I did not have a young person walk through my doors for services in that process. And are we almost always full in our housing facilities? And I've got the largest in this entire region. The answer is absolutely yes. And that is what I can say also for my sister affiliates across the country and many others. So yes, it is a growing phenomenon, and some of that, the contributed factors include because it has become more unaffordable to live in most of our cities. And so as housing becomes more and more unaffordable, it's not just young people, it is also families that are finding that it is very difficult, in fact, to find housing, and in addition to some other factors.
So last November, there was really a groundbreaking study on youth and young adult homelessness put out by Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. So I want to respond to sort of youth homelessness prevalence, student homelessness, which is different but related, and then also the sort of the trend line. So for this Chapin Hall study, was the first study of its kind, was a Gallup poll. They did a representative sample, and they found that for youth who were experiencing homelessness on their own, 13 to 17-year-olds, 700,000, or 1 in 30. And for 18 to 25-year-olds, it was 3.5 million over the course of a year. So that, some form of homelessness over the course of a year, that's 1 in 10. So that, I think, that's kind of our baseline looking at youth and young adult homelessness. Student homelessness at the higher education level, as I'm sure many people are aware, is sort of a new area of study, of inquiry, so we don't really have baseline data, but I'm sure you've seen the Hope Lab, Wisconsin Hope Lab study showing that approximately 9 to 10% of four-year institutions report homelessness during the past year, 15 to 14% on community colleges. So it's broader, I think, than many people think about. In terms of the trend lines, again, we don't have higher ed trend line, and because Chapin Hall is so new, we don't have kind of the trend line from that study, but we do have trend lines from K-12, and those numbers have gone up significantly since 2007. Public schools identified 1.3 million in the last school year. That's a 7% increase. It's gone up every year. The numbers will come out again at the end of this month, and it'll show an increase as well. Whether that's because we're getting better at identifying or because there actually are increases, I think is a question. But certainly the states and the school districts and the institutions who are doing things exactly the same way do report increases, having to turn more youth away from services, et cetera. So a lot of things go into that, economics, housing, and a lot of family issues as well. You
just mentioned K through 12, and you were speaking to the 1.3 million, but then there's also, as I understand it, the transition from K to 12 can be a really pivotal time with homelessness. So can you speak to that a little bit about how that transition from the K through 12 into higher education can impact homelessness among our students?
So, I mean, I will say that, you know, having lived in the K-12 system for a while, I was deputy superintendent of a school system prior to being in this role at Covenant House. And so, as I said, you know, some of the ability to keep young people stable with McKinney-Vento, you know, leaves as they leave that K-12 environment. But in addition, what you see that happens with that is, you know, you're going into a new arena that is somewhat unfamiliar to a lot of the young people. The supports are not there. So as you think about what is it that has helped to maintain some level of stability, you suddenly now are thrust into this new environment in the college or university arena where many of those young people and their families don't understand those supports. I will say that from my perspective as a chief executive officer at Covenant House, many of my young people that are in college, I am still providing supports to them, even though those supports should be on that campus someplace. So whether that is I need some remedial support in even some of my studies, I need someone to help me navigate questions that I don't do. They're not finding the supports that they need on that campus or the trust that's there because, again, there's a big factor around trust. And when that isn't there, what you'll see oftentimes is this isolation, or they revert back to the places that they know. And so a lot of them are going back to spaces. And so the colleges or universities may not even know that those concerns are there. And so how do we open that door and create a warmer handshake between the K-12 and the university system for those that have had to have additional supports, I think is a critical need.
And I'm not being rude by scrolling through my email. I actually have a great email from one of the students in our scholarship program about this very topic that's super powerful that I want to find and read to you. There are a lot of challenges that come up, very beautifully articulated in terms of not having the protections of McKinney-Vento at the higher education level. We do have some strong provisions that were put into K-12 law just 2 years ago to assist with that transition. So counselors needing to prepare and advise young people for college, the FAFSA. But again, once the K-12 system goes away, then there's that challenge. I think for homeless youth, the FAFSA becomes increasingly more difficult in subsequent years because to be considered an independent student, homeless unaccompanied youth have to have some form of verification. They can't go back to the liaison. They can go to a Runaway and Homeless Youth Act provider, but the financial aid, we've seen a lot of challenges with financial aid administrators who, despite having the authority and the responsibility to determine a youth status as unaccompanied and homeless for their financial aid, doesn't happen. And not to blame an entire profession, but they've got a huge list of things they're responsible for and kind of a compliance-minded. So Jillian and I get a lot of emails from youth and young adults and liaisons who are like, hey, I can't prove that I have nowhere to go. I'm being asked for paperwork. So if you don't have financial aid, then that's the end of the road. So I want to sort of raise the issue of financial aid as a continuing barrier for youth who are homeless and on their own. That supportive adult, not having somebody there. One of our youth in our scholarship program, her words were, graduating high school was devastating. I lost my entire support system. So you think about a young person who's been through homeless in high school, and then they get to graduation, and instead of that being a celebratory day, she saw it as like just the sort of the end, and she really had to work hard to find those supports. And I'm glad there's a part 2 of this conversation, because we'll find out about the good things that are happening to sort of address that lapse. And then I would say some of the challenges, so the last category of challenges have to do with things like move-in fees. You're trying to get your place on campus, but you may not have had your financial aid yet. So just getting a place on housing on campus can be challenging. And then I would say sort of the last category, and if I find my student quote, I'll pull it up, has to do with kind of culture shock. When you're going to school, and a lot of first-generation low-income students have that same experience of culture shock. But for students who've been experiencing homelessness, they may question, is this even where I belong? So some of those social, emotional issues can be real challenging in the transition as well.
Absolutely. I'm just piggyback one other point in that the verification process, as you said, is tremendous and it's difficult, and oftentimes we can provide that support during year one, and so you get them through even the first year. The issue becomes in year two, and many of the colleges and universities, it's an annual verification process. Well, they no longer have those connects anymore. And so now it is, where do I go? There are a few progressive universities I know that, will allow once that verification has happened, you don't have to come back year after year. But again, as you said, it just depends on how that infrastructure is within the school or university. It does impact the financial aid tremendously. And not only may it impact it, it can oftentimes delay it, even if you're doing that. So the delay itself will mean that you can become housing unstable or clearly food unstable. And it was interesting, I think, when the comment came in from the other room and they were talking about the instability of food as if it were not real. And, it was tough not to get up and have a conversation around that, because the two really do go hand in hand, and oftentimes they are making decisions about, where do I sleep and what do I eat? And sometimes even if decisions are made to do things that seem to be not smart, it's oftentimes a coping because I can't figure out how to do the rest of this.
I found my email. Thank you for giving me the time. Okay, so this is from one of our scholarship students. She said, I could have used a mentor. Sure, I had a homeless liaison in K-12, but I didn't meet her until I was out of high school. No one really prepared me for the difficult transition to college as a homeless youth, and I didn't really understand the concept of college until my junior year of high school. But as a homeless youth, it would have been cool for someone to give me a talk about the real-life struggles I might have come across. Legit almost dropped out my first semester because I was so depressed and no one else understood why. It was culture shock to the max, being around so many privileged people. She did graduate, and she's getting her master's in social work, but she was just sort of reflecting back on those challenges. Yeah.
So you both have really hit on this in your last response, so I'm going to ask you to highlight for us some other ways in which the transition from K through 12 or being homeless during the K through 12 years impacts someone during their college career. So if it impacts their academic performance, other issues, you mentioned culture shock, other issues of their social life. So what are some of those impacts that they're going to face when they come to college beyond the financial aid that we spoke about before?
I mean, one of the obvious it is that they're often just not prepared for is just the independence. And so, whereas it is seen as a real plus and a positive, and, now you're suddenly going to be an independent young person, that is a very scary space, particularly when you haven't necessarily had everything you need to develop through your K-12 years to develop to the point that you're ready for that level of independence. And I would sometimes even question even if any of our college students are ready for that level of independence. But when you're thrust out there and there's not a phone call that you can pick up and say, can I get this? Often, as I said, I am sending many care packages up to colleges and universities. We are providing things that normally a family might provide. But if you think about for many of those young people without those connects, without family, or there isn't anybody at the other end of that phone line. So where do I go for those things that oftentimes people think are a no-brainer, and you should have those. So whether that is additional books or somehow now the lab teacher decided that we needed to get a different resource. Well, nobody talked about that. So where is that supposed to come from? And how am I now supposed to sit here and figure that out and not look like I have less than others in that room? Even just some of the additional support. So I would say, the independence factor is one of those. And then the expectation, if there are emergencies that come up, somehow you're just going to figure it out, or you can call someone to take care of it. That doesn't exist.
I had written down care packages, so I'm glad that you mentioned that. We didn't plan this. I would say two additional pieces. Housing during breaks becomes very, very challenging. Again, very similarly related to not having a home of your own. And so it's actually very similar to youth from foster care and some of the same very issues. In the same way, we'd never say for youth in foster care, well, a house is going to fix it all. In the same way for youth experiencing homelessness, we need to think very comprehensively and ahead of time so that youth aren't like looking on Craigslist instead of focusing on their studies and really going through a lot of stress and making some really difficult decisions because they don't know where they were going to stay. I was in Texas 2 weeks ago, and again, another one of our students, said she really was just really lucky that one friend said she could come back with them because they shut the dorms down, and she didn't have anywhere to go. So that becomes a factor which is related to their K-12 experience. The other thing I'll say too is I put in this bucket of family conflicts, and because sometimes if the entire family is experiencing homelessness, the youth who's decided to go on to college, even though that may be the only way they will ever be economically independent, they will ever be able to afford housing, and the same for any young person, they're worried about their siblings. And they're worried about how they support their siblings. If the entire family is experiencing homelessness, they don't have a place to go. But I know one of our young men, he was like, he felt really guilty that he had food on campus, but his siblings didn't. And so he was challenged in terms of his financial aid and how he was supporting the family. And this may not be unique to students who are experiencing homelessness. I'm sure I know other low-income first-generation students have those struggles. But when you're looking at, well, gosh, I could be paying for my parents' or my mom's rent as opposed to doing what I'm doing, then that becomes an additional struggle.
That's exactly right. I mean, a lot of them really do struggle with that and oftentimes make the decision during the second semester of next year that I can't make that because you do feel guilty around it. But I do want to, appreciate you talking about during breaks. The expectation, everybody is excited, everybody's leaving campus, everybody's going home for the breaks, and there's no place to go. So I will often at the break time have this influx of new young people to come back, and they're looking at you like they used to live. They're like, what's going to happen to us now? But even not just even the scheduled breaks, like as an example, one of my college students, it was doing Florence just recently. So the university was closing down, and everybody had to go somewhere. And it was, so we're getting calls back like, what am I supposed to do? I don't have any place to go. Families were preparing for them to come back or finding some place in the community to do that. And so I think even on those universities, just recognizing that there are oftentimes young people, maybe similar to young people that may have migrated to the country and maybe our immigrant young people, let's think about that there is a population of them that there isn't any place for them to go. We actually had to drive down and get him.
So we've heard the term housing gap. Is there such thing as a dorm gap? Does this exist?
You want to start?
And by dorm gap, you mean like
no dorm?
No dorms, like community college, or?
And I think discrepancies or disparities between who has access and the costs of living, and where I know there's with private and public as well. Yes.
So, I mean, one thing I know, again, both from our experience working with young people, but also just from our experience with institutions, is sometimes, for example, even there'll be, you can stay in the dorm for a fee, or like over breaks, for example, and the person won't have a fee for that. Or there'll be a policy that international students or athletes can stay, but that same policy isn't extended to others. So I think sometimes there's an equity issue there. And certainly just the things too, I mean, having there's the dorm, but there's all the things that you need for the dorm too, whether it's supplies, sheets, some of the base things that we take for granted as well. So I think the way that college is, the way the college-going population, and this was said during the keynote at lunch too, that sort of the traditional who goes to college has a lot of assumptions built into it. And so for students who are experiencing homelessness or who become homeless after high school, that's where some of the lack of basics and the lack of a place to go, if it's not thought about at the institutional level from the beginning, it needs to be more than just sort of an emergency response. So, and I know Jillian will talk about some of the practical responses tomorrow.
I think the other, in some cases, I mean, there are a number of universities, clearly there's not enough dorm rooms for many of those young people, so they're making different choices about, who has to stay, how long can you stay, what class level. But particularly in some of the two-year institutions, In junior colleges, there are no dorms even associated with that institution. And so there are many of those students that are experiencing homelessness that don't even use those and don't even look at them as a choice to go to, because housing has to be a part of the solution in moving to the next level, because they're leaving where they currently are. So the next space has to also have some kind of a solution to it. So I know that that becomes, in fact, even as they're doing all the preparation and exploration for colleges and universities to attend, one of the first things on that list is there housing associated with it.
So, Barbara, you mentioned in your last response that college students have changed, and we've talked about that throughout the day, and I think that maybe you mentioned this as well. So what can you tell us about the student demographics of individuals or students who find themselves most vulnerable to homelessness?
Well, back to the Chapin Hall University of Chicago study, African American, Hispanic, LGBT youth were all at much, much higher risk of experiencing homelessness. Also, former foster youth and those who had some experience in the juvenile justice system were at much, much greater risk. In terms of the California State University study, first-generation African-American students were at far greater risk, something like 10% of CSU students, but for first-generation African-American, it was something like 18% of CSU students, first generation, experienced homelessness. And the only thing I think I would add to that is just, yeah, I think that's that's sort of what the research tells us, and maybe Covenant House has similar.
No, I mean, I think along those lines, those are, pretty similar to what we're seeing. But I think the other part of the question you were saying, how does the demographic of the college student, how has that changed? And, I think, without speaking for you, because you guys are doing your own data around that, but, clearly I think we see that there is a broadening of who goes to college. They're aging, they're becoming older in many cases, they're having more experiences in that process. So whether that is, an older youth, whether there's someone with a family, a child is included in that process. So sometimes the obstacles that have gotten in the way of people continuing in a lot of stead now has shown itself up in the college and university environment as well. So now I've got childcare as an issue. Now there's some transportation issues. Now those are all those kinds of things that people didn't worry about. Like, that's not my issue. Like, what are you up here talking about this with? And yet those are the kinds of things that, you have to wrap around the supports for here. So we're used to that, regardless of whether that youth is still at the K-12 level or they move forward in that. Those obstacles are often still there because it is a richer, a deeper, and a much more diverse young person or older person that is pursuing higher education. Credentials are important. If you're going to proceed in life, you got to have some additional credentials, and I think that's one of the things that why we're seeing that diversity grow.
And I'll just add one thing too. I think, when the topic, and this was interesting for me because my background is children and youth. So I come at this from children, youth, young people. And then when this whole basic needs movement sort of appeared in higher education, addressing basic needs in higher ed, I was like, well, what about youth who are experiencing homelessness? So I think just in terms of the demographics and who experiences homelessness and the intersection of student homelessness, that it's important when we get to solutions to think about, for example, a housing solution for a youth or young adult could look different for a housing solution for an older student who's experiencing homelessness in college. And we don't at all mean to say that the focus should just be on youth and young adults who are going to college. We know that there are older students who are experiencing homelessness on college campuses, but just to say that the responses, because of developmentally, the needs of youth and young adult will need to be different.
Can you just briefly tell us if there are any geographic regions of the country that are more vulnerable, or types of regions, if it's a rural campus versus an urban campus, where we might see more homelessness?
I don't think that we have the research to say yet about higher education and homelessness and what sorts of, other than community colleges. We know community colleges, there's a higher prevalence of student homelessness based on the studies, but I don't think we know enough. I don't think it's been studied enough to know. What I can say about youth homelessness, though, and again, my Chapin Hall study, they did show that the prevalence of youth and young adult homelessness was statistically the same in rural, suburban, and urban areas. It was just hidden in suburban and rural areas. So I think based on that, if we just look at youth and young adult homelessness, we could expect the same, but I think the challenges in higher ed would be things like transportation and things that, pose a barrier, or not having housing on campus.
And I would support that. I mean, in another life, even prior to my education life, I think I had a national role in United Way Worldwide in that process. And so when you look at this issue of where you're experiencing, the poverty, the challenges, and homelessness in that process, it is sparkled throughout the country. So the urban centers, we see it a lot, and it may be more prevalent in that we hear more of it, and perhaps we are addressing it differently, and so it's up to the front and center more. But clearly in the rural and in the suburban arenas, you also have the same kinds of experiences, but maybe because of population, you may not have the levels, but you clearly still have the same needs.
So I know that we have a couple questions that have come in from live stream, so I'm going to get to my last question, and then we'll turn it over to Devin. He'll bring those questions up to us. So you have right now captured an audience here in person as well as live stream of many college administrators and individuals who are working on college campuses. So what do you think is most important or salient to communicate to us for how we should be prepared to address this problem, or innovative strategies that you've seen for addressing it on our campuses?
I mean, one of the first things I would say is just creating a welcome and opening environment where that it is comfortable to even acknowledge who you are. So the word homelessness, most people don't even want to be identified with. And so creating sometimes terminology, transitions and housing and experiencing. So you've got to create the campaign around it that people can feel comfortable walking through that door with a sense of dignity and respect, because you need to know they're there, and they need to know that you were there for them. And in doing that, it opens the opportunity to really connect those services. There are a lot of supportive services that are on the college and university levels. We actually have gone in with our young person and gone back to campus and actually made some of those connections, but the youth didn't know they were there, and the college didn't know that the youth was there. So opening those doors, I think, is important.
I would agree with all of that. I think the awareness piece is really critical. Even if you don't, there's not an obvious problem of homelessness on campus, the students are definitely there. We were at, Jillian and I went to Real College in Philadelphia 2 weekends ago, and there was a really robust conversation about where do you get started on college campus with these issues. So many of them talked about a survey, for example, whether it's the Project Hope, the Hope Lab study, or doing some sort of survey to sort of increase awareness and understand that, yes, there is an issue, sort of taking that that as a first step. You can prove it's real if you do this survey, and now there's a lot of support in filling out those surveys. Also having some of your connections with the K-12, so find out who the K-12 McKinney-Vento liaison is, reach out to the state coordinator to build those partnerships, by that pipeline, the transition. The community partnerships, if you're lucky enough to have a Covenant House in your community, to reach out to your Covenant House, but if not, find out who the homeless youth services folks are and make those connections. And we also heard a lot about connections to public housing agencies, which I thought was really great too, in terms of those fostering those collaborations. So awareness, whether through studies and stories, and then these partnerships both with the K-12 and then within the community as well.
Evan?
We do have several questions online. First is, how are we going about identifying which students are homeless on campus in a way that does not put a stigma on it?
I think that was a part of what we were just kind of responding to. It's creating that climate, that open door. I know when I was in the K-12 system, we changed the whole title of the office. It wasn't the Office of Homelessness. We actually called it an Office about Transition Housing, and that allowed those families to feel more comfortable coming there. It is not about a space. So when you call a person homeless, you talk about who they are versus this journey of experiencing a homelessness at that time. So I would say language is a big part of that. You know, what are there campaigns? Are there brochures? Where are you promoting it there on campus? And then is it a confidential space so that they can come into, so that they can feel that if I do go to that office or that door, that I don't actually have to feel embarrassed around that. So I think removing some of the stigma is an important component of that, and not making young people feel that there's something to blame because of your situation at that particular time. But let's welcome with open doors, and we know that there's some, you know, shining stars that are out there to support that.
And to add to that, two ideas. One is working with financial aid office, because youth who are checking, there's 3 questions on the FAFSA about homelessness. And so, and then financial aid administrators also can make their determination. So we know some institutions are partnering with financial aid so that they can send out to anybody who checked one of those questions without any getting into confidentiality or sharing data, letting them know that their services are available. Another one of our partners said that basically anyone who's under 24 and has dependents is a good proxy for somebody who may be experiencing homelessness or came from an abusive situation or foster care. So being creative that way. Also, we're seeing professors put on their syllabus when they're putting out for the class, sort of if you're experiencing any housing challenges or food challenges, you can contact me or contact student services. So when professors put that information out there, it kind of normalizes it and destigmatizes it, and it gets it out to everybody in a very broad fashion. And then thirdly, just sort of like if you have, whether it can be supportive services or some place on campus, again, you know, a wellness program, a basic needs program, or something like that, where it's a welcoming environment and people who know they're having challenges, which could include homelessness, would feel like that's a place where they could go and feel safe.
So in that same vein, one of the questions we had was, it said students seem to be more willing to respond to housing insecure rather than being identified as homeless. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And again, I think that speaks to terminology for, you know, for us here in Greater Washington as an example. You know, we don't talk about homeless youth. We talk about youth experiencing homelessness. None of our housing centers are called a shelter. They are housing. I either have emergency, transitional, or supportive housing. And so language is very important. This is really about dignity and respect. If you can imagine, if you have to walk down that corridor where you don't know how you're going to find a safe place to sleep tonight, one of the last things that you want is for you to also be stigmatized by a title that also says to you that you're less than who you really think you are. So I think it is very important to think about language as you're creating that culture so that they feel safe and warm and welcome.
Nothing to add.
What's been your experiences in finding mental health resources for these students?
You can say that.
It's tough. It's really tough. It is tough because depending on the state and whether there's what they're doing with Medicaid and extension, you can maybe speak to that too with some of the students. It can be very hard to get any insurance if it's not offered through their campuses. So I know with our students in our scholarship program, the fact that they're under 26 but they weren't in foster care, and there's no parent that they can go to any of that, it becomes very challenging depending on the level of mental health, you know, what it actually requires. And then there's just sort of whether they think that they need it or not, sort of how they feel comfortable seeking it out. So I would say with our students in our scholarship program, it's probably the #1 need is dealing with the trauma from their childhood and then having that pop up later and get in the way. And sometimes we're successful connecting them on campus, sometimes we're not. And again, depending on if it rises to the level of needing psychiatric help, that's where we have the challenges with healthcare.
Absolutely. I think it is the #1 challenge that many of us in this space actually face, recognizing, and I would say that, you know, looking at probably 95% of all the young people that walk in my door need some level of support. And you can imagine if you've had one night that you didn't know where you were going to sleep or you didn't know where you were going to eat, the trauma that goes along with that. And we're talking persistent and long-term around that in many cases. So it is a reality. I think also, how do you take the stigma off of it? And so, you know, are we calling it mental health, which sometimes young people think, oh, you're saying that I'm crazy. And it's like, how do we create really, again, this common understanding of the supportive process? And so wellness is one of those terms that if when integrating in what this supportive service is for young people, it's there, but also having healthcare coverage is also a challenge and is critical in many cases to ensuring that they can either get initial or clearly the level of support they need.
More question?
One more. This question is around campus administrators. So how do you work with campus administrators to make them knowledgeable about housing insecurity issues that may be on their campus and how to address them?
So I'll start with and then move on. For us, we actually reach out to those campuses and colleges that are in our area. We also belong to some coalitions because we want to also make sure that they know who we are as a contact. We're trying to look at for that. It is a growing area of support, I would say. It's not there yet. In some colleges and universities, we have a better relationship than others. In a number of them, they reach back out to us, particularly when there's emergency housing situations. People would be surprised at the number of young people that we provide some emergency support for that university because, you know, something happened, whether it was the financial aid isn't here yet, the young person just found a challenge in whatever was happening, or the university just doesn't have any space for this. So I think that it is clearly something that needs to increase. And as I said, we're part of a couple coalitions and looking at how to create stronger handshakes. A number of providers are with that, with some of the colleges and universities in this region. I would just encourage it to continue.
I think inviting college administrators to convenings that may be happening around hunger and homelessness. There is National Hunger and Homeless Awareness Week. I think it's the 3rd week of November. It's the week right before Thanksgiving. So that's a great opportunity because many student groups will be doing activities. It's sponsored by, I'm forgetting the name of the student group, but it's a national student group. And so because student groups are involved in that, that's a great opportunity. I also think highlighting examples of what other institutions have done. So it's not like, hey, you go first. It's like, hey, people have done this. Kennesaw State's doing something awesome. And, you know, CSU Long Beach is doing something awesome. And all these pieces. So it doesn't become like they're not put in the position of having to be a cheerleader where no one else has ever gone yet. And sort of showing some practical first steps can be really helpful. Yeah, those are my basic.
I think let me just piggyback a little bit about that week. You're exactly right. In fact, during that week, Covenant House does something called Sleep Out. In Sleep Out America, we actually are engaged with a number of the college and university campuses where young people actually have the opportunity, as we do in some of our other ways in which we do sleep out, but you actually can sleep out and experience one night what it feels like. It is a fundraiser, it is a heightened awareness event, but it also has been really successful in identifying during that week and heightening during that week, you know, the realities of some of the students that are on campus, but also getting others involved in that.
And I just thought of one last thing too, which I think part of it is framing. Like if an institution looks at this as like these students are a burden and we got to do all these things for them and not seeing what the students bring, and their resilience is just astounding. To have gone through everything that they've gone through, to see that, you know, addressing homelessness on campus is a retention strategy, it's a completion strategy, it's a talent strategy. So looking at it that way, I know one of my colleagues at Western Michigan University, they have a scholarship there, and they had the students who were either DACA students or from foster care experiencing homelessness present to the board, and they are all high achieving. Not all of them, not everyone's going to be high achieving given their background, but for them it was about reframing it and showing the potential as opposed to just the deficits of these students. And that kind of got people on board and really charged up about what they were doing.
I think one of the other important connects too, which we haven't talked about a lot in this session, but you know, the connection with homelessness and human trafficking. And so for a number of our young people, both males and females, and those that are trying to stay in school, unfortunately, that becomes a part of that equation. So Covenant House actually did the largest study on human trafficking for young people across the country. It was in 13 different states. They looked at it through the lens of the Covenant House in 12 of those cities, and you saw some astounding stats about that connection, their ability to remain stable in what they were doing, whether that was just everyday living or going on to their educational goals in that process. But one of them, one of the stats here in DC that I think is just completely astounding was that we found that of those that were studied, 33% of them found and basically noted that on their very first night of not having safe housing, they were either approached for sex or by a trafficker. And so what you know is that there is a strong connection. There's a lot of predatory practices that are going on out there. The exploitation, whether it is for sex or labor, is out there. And young people, particularly those that are in college, because you now are more open and needing more funds, really become a target. And in fact, oftentimes they're recruiting even on those campuses, looking for those vulnerable young people that need some additional funds to stay where they are. So I think that is another part of this that I would say that you guys need to keep your eyes and ears open around.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to our audience members and those that are live streaming. I think that we've really brought forward some critical issues and been very enlightened today, and seen really implications and how exponential these are for students who are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. So we really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts with us. We will be taking a 10-minute break and reconvening here at 2:30 for the next session, which is meeting the needs of off-campus students. Thank you.
Very nice meeting you.